Well, hello, my dear friends at Upaya, and all of those who are listening from the Mahasangha around the world that Upaya has created. Uh, there's a wonderful short poem by Hafiz, the great Persian passion poet, that maybe is a good way to start a program on love and death. He says, the subject tonight is love, and for tomorrow night as well. Or we could say for Friday night. As a matter of fact, I know of no better topic for us to discuss until we all die. That's a feast. Yeah. When I was about, I don't know, 18 years old, I learned a lot about love. I was, I taught swimming at a school for severely disabled kids. And there was this, I remember, very beautiful young girl, 16 years old. She probably would have been the homecoming queen in most schools if it hadn't been for her spina bifida. The disease kind of contorted her body, and it made her very shy, actually, and self-conscious. And she wasn't willing to put on a bathing suit and join us in the pool. But she loved to watch and make wisecracks and flirt with the lifeguard, me. So I spent, I don't know, months, I think, trying to encourage her to give swimming a try. Each day she'd come, and I try to playfully reflect back to her strength and her courage and the beauty that I saw emanating from within her. And she'd regularly come with her classmates and keep her distance from the pool. And then one day, after many months of this kind of encouragement, she rolled up to the edge of the marble edge of the pool that was elevated, and she put her disabled legs onto the edge and took off her heavy braces and her orthopedic shoes, and she dipped her toes in the water. Yeah, it was very sweet to see. And then months passed without her doing much more than that. And I kept encouraging her. And one day, after about 6 months, she came rolling out of the locker room in her blue turquoise bathing suit. And without any prompting, she maneuvered her twisted and skinny legs up onto the pool's edge, and she called me close. Frank, come here. And then, wow, with this big, huge smile on her face, she leaped into my arms like a 7-year-old child. When someone believes that they are beyond love, you can't convince them to love themselves, but you can show them that they're loved. Great Irish poet, Cannell, he wrote, sometimes it's necessary to reteach a thing its loveliness. When I was a boy, teenager, there was a lot of suffering in my life. I had alcoholic parents that were hard to be with, violent. I experienced years of physical and sexual abuse in my life. And in the horror of my own suffering, I always held out the hope that one day someone would come and rescue me. I think a lot of kids that are hurting imagine that. And I thought, somehow I would be saved by love coming toward me. But actually, it was just the opposite. I was rescued when love came through me. I discovered love through acts of kindness, not offered to me, but coming from me. And I think of the words of the great late John O'Donohue, the wild Irish poet. And he said something like, we do not need to go out and find love. Rather, we need to be still and let love discover us. In a way, isn't that what we do in our Zazen practice? For me, that experience in the school with the disabled kids, with Jasmine and the other kids, it unlocked a kind of compassion that was hidden deep in the heart of my suffering. And I discovered this love that was, in a way, essential, innate, reliable, vast, and undamaged. And I think that love, that I discovered there in the heart of my own suffering, I think that became my true support later, and a kind of guide for me later when I was doing accompanying people who were dying at the Zen Hospice Project. So I would say that love has been my mentor in my whole life. Love itself has taught me to love. And what I've noticed is that boundlessness of love is often made evident when the veils between the worlds, well, I would say between this world and what we might think of as the invisible world, are thinnest. So at birth and at death, love seems to melt all division. And it allows us to move beyond what we thought was possible. And to do things we couldn't have imagined, actually. Like I know many women, actually, who have labored through powerful, strong contractions of childbirth, somehow finding their way through unbelievable exhaustion and pain and fear, only to discover this upwelling of love that was unlike anything they'd ever known before. And similarly, I've witnessed countless experiences of that at the time of death. Like a daughter I sat with once who couldn't let go of her father, just kept hanging on with deep attachment, I'll call it, and deep love, actually. And then at some juncture, I don't even know what gave rise to it. She released him, saying, "It's okay, Daddy. I love you, and you can go now." Or there was this doctor that I worked with. He was a famous doctor at Stanford. And he saw that physician-assisted death was his best option when he was maybe 2 years into his diagnosis of ALS, which is a very debilitating disease. And that's when we talked for the first time. And through our discussion, well, it became clear to him that he had one more task to do in his life. He'd always been a great dad, introducing his children to the world. And he realized that he had one more task in his life. And that was to teach his children how to gracefully meet dying. And out of his love for them and his big, generous heart, he lived actually for another few years, which was an amazing gift to his children. I'm thinking now of my Roshis and my dear friend Ramdas, who every day that I knew him since his strokes, he worked with what he called fierce grace, the fierce grace of pain and suffering that he lived with every day, all day, in order to serve others and to learn more about love, actually. I remember we were all at his memorial service, and Krishna Das said, "Oh, Ramdas finally became what he'd been talking about his whole life. He'd always been talking about love, and honestly, at the end of his life, that's all he was, pure love." But I think in those moments that I'm describing, at birth or at death or powerful moments in between, you know, we can glimpse, I would say, a love without limitation, a love that's completely unlike the kind of, mm, I don't know, what is it that we often do, a kind of business love that we have in our relationships, a commerce like love that characterizes a lot of our relationships. I'll love you if. I think this love that I'm speaking of, it's a completely different order of love, one that springs from the very source of our being. And it recognizes and responds to the intrinsic goodness of the human heart. And this love is both profoundly receptive and dynamically expressive. Mm. This facet of love that I'm speaking to, mm, it represents a kind of universal aspiration, right? That all beings, including ourselves, will find happiness and the causes of happiness. And I would say it exists before and beyond conditions. It's not something to be achieved or that we can claim with our personalities or, it's not an idealistic love, actually. It's not attained on the path. It's not a spiritual state to achieve. In a way, it's always present. And our practice helps us to discover that. That's all. Ramdas used to say, we're nothing but love. And I would disagree with him. Because firstly, I don't think that our being is just love. I think our Buddha nature is, well, it's composed of many qualities, I think. Our brilliance, our strength, our luminosity. But love is, well, it permeates all those qualities. It's inseparable from all those qualities. It's woven into the very fabric of existence. And here's the thing, because that love is the very essence of our nature, it's always available to us. When we're stuck or wounded or our minds are lost in our dramas. So it's here to help us meet the challenges that are here with us and the ones that are yet to come. And what I've seen in my life is that love just dissolves my defenses, dissolves my self-image, it dissolves my confusion, my unresolved losses, my core wound of separation. It heals. Love heals. I think so often we imagine that the tension and holding that we use to I don't know, forge this kind of armoring around our hearts. Will keep out the pain. It'll make us invulnerable. But I think this armoring that we forge, I think it cuts us off from life, cuts us off from love. It dulls our sensitivity. It locks out the tenderness and the mercy that we so often need. And as a result, I think we become very frightened living behind that shield. But if we're willing to just be still, as John O'Donohue was reminding us, we can relax. And our habitual strategies will reveal themselves, the ones that have enclosed us and trapped us. And that love helps us to open and to recognize the spaciousness of our nature, and whatever we can give space to can move. And as we do, I think what we'll discover is that all of us sitting here and even the armoring around our hearts, it was never separate from this love. In my language, this love, well, it's what allows us to welcome everything and push away nothing. It helps us to discover the fearless openness that's required to turn towards suffering. I think that's only possible through the receptivity of love. Remember at the hospice, there was this guy who I really loved. He was kind of a grandpa figure to me, and he was a kind of homegrown philosopher. And it seemed like every conversation, could be a sort of never-ending stream of questions from him. He had a wonderful, bright, inquiring mind, keen intellect, actually. But what I loved most about him was his heart. And I noticed it. I just would watch him, how he would welcome people into his room at the hospice and meet people in this very kind way. I remember one time we had some high school teenagers visiting the hospice, and they were touring, if you will. And he invited them into his room, and welcomed them in. But then he did this wonderful thing. He just sat there and listened to them as these two teenagers, who were very nervous, started describing scene by scene one of their favorite movies, some Marvel hero, movie. They told him every scene. And he just listened generously. Not so much out of interest for the film, but out of his care for them, actually. And, here we were at the Zen hospice, and Carl was surrounded by Buddhist practitioners. And so inevitably, he started asking about meditation, which was not his thing, and he wanted to know how he could use meditation. And Carl had very severe abdominal cancer, and he had a morphine pump that he used to manage his pain, but it made him foggy, and the morphine did, and he wanted to see if meditation could somehow be a substitute for that. And so I remember that he asked me if I would teach him to meditate, and I said, sure, yeah. I was hesitant often, actually, because I wanted people to really find their own way. But so he started, and I sort of gave him a little guidance. But I noticed as I was guiding him, his forehead got, tight and furrowed, and there was a kind of tension in his body. He was trying to use meditation to make something happen. You know? And I thought we have to try a different way. So I went up to him. We were very dear friends, and I put my two hands on his belly, and I said, just see if you can feel the place under my hands. And he began to bring his attention there, and he just screamed. He said, "It's too much. It's too much." And I said, "Okay, okay." I said, "Let me pull my hands a little further away." And so I did. And I said, "How's that?" And he said, "Oh, it's a little better. It still hurts." So I said, "Okay, let me pull my hands away still further." And he said, "Oh, that's getting better." And so I pulled my hands still further away. I mean, I wasn't doing any energetic healing. I wasn't doing any California woo-woo stuff. I was just making space around the pain, actually. And when I pulled my hands fairly far out from his belly, he said, "Oh, that's lovely. That's lovely." I said, "Okay, good." And then out of his mouth, not out of mine, he said, "Rest in love, rest in love." That was his mantra. And so then from then on, whenever he'd get in pain, he'd push his morphine pump and say to himself, "Rest in love, rest in love." Yeah, good guidance. I remember his wife would come to visit, and she was very nervous, very anxious to be with him around his pain. And she'd sit there, and I'd see her foot tapping on the floor when she was visiting with him. And he'd sort of reach through the bars on the hospital bed and put his hand on her leg, and he'd say, "Darling, darling, rest in love, rest in love." Darling, darling, rest in love. I remember sharing this story with Ram Dass one morning at breakfast, and he said, "Oh, he touched something. He touched loving awareness." Well, that was Ram Dass's way of talking about it. And when we're willing to love, it doesn't mean that we tolerate bad behavior or we can't say no. I mean, all of us, everyone here, right? We fall prey to doubt and unworthiness and boredom and desire and resentment. At times, all of us, myself included, we're driven by our temperaments and our beliefs and our lifestyles. And I don't think love eliminates any of these, but I think it does provide us with a way of approaching life that softens our identification with these tendencies and helps keep unskillful habits at bay, keeps them from hardening into our character. It's what helps us accept ourselves, all of us, every part of ourselves, and the things that are unwanted in our life, the illness or the loss of a job or the ending of a relationship. What happens when fear arises? I think when love's present, when it's infusing our awareness, then we can witness what's occurring for us. We can bear witness, as Bernie would say. And that becomes our default, our way of being in the world, rather than fear. My daughter and I were shopping in used clothing stores. We used to do it a lot when she was a teenager, and she would find just this perfect little blouse or cool scarf or something, and she'd go try it on in the dressing room, and I'd look around on the racks for something else, something that I thought she would really like. And I remember finding this old jacket And it said $9.95 as is. And it was a leather jacket. It was really cool. I thought, $9.95, that's amazing. And then I looked at the tag and it said as is. And I thought, wow, what a great thing. We should get those tags for each other. I take you as is. What a wonderful gift that is. That should be our Christmas present to each other. Just a tag as is. I think one of love's most exquisite capacities is the ability to just embrace whatever's it comes into contact with, right? Even if at first that situation or that experience or that person seems unlovable. Because in my experience, love doesn't concern itself with who or what it should love. Loving awareness just embraces whatever it comes into contact with, whether that's sadness or loneliness or fear or depression or physical pain. Love is not a gated community. That's what I always say. Everything's welcomed in, every part of ourself and every part of everyone else. No part left out, we say in Zen, right? That's the receptive function of love. And if we found this treasure in our lives, there's no point in keeping it to ourselves. The ground of love is limitless. And so we don't have to be stingy about it. And we don't have to get caught up in scarcity. We can give it away freely. It's not a commodity to be traded. And, one of the ways we all know that we can tap into the, boundless quality of love and express that love is through the practice of metta, right? Loving kindness practice. It's a way we consciously evoke this wholehearted, boundless feeling of love. And then through the recitation of phrases, we share it with all beings everywhere. When I was doing deep Brahma Vihara practice for a few months, the 120 classes of beings that you share metta with, including beings in hell realms and all over. It's a beautiful practice. That's the expressive side of love. Expresses this desire for peacefulness and good conditions, the welfare of others. Can't be owned, but it can be cultivated with practice. I remember that years ago, um, a woman I know, longtime Zen practitioner, invited me to come and talk to her husband, Michael, about his dying. He was dying of degenerative disease. And so I went to see him, a Zen priest. And actually, he wasn't so interested in the subject of dying. And so instead, we talked about his paintings and his love of detail that he had to surrender now because his hands shook uncontrollably. And we talked about what else was emerging in this process with shaky hands. And we talked about the beauty of the plum tree outside his window. And we talked about his wife, which men do more than women might imagine. And we talked about his pruning tools, which he loved, and his paintbrushes, how to care for them. And we also talked about the profundity of Zen practice and the power of silence. the paradoxical teachings that make our heads spin. And we touched on the simplicity of relinquishing things, yeah. And I asked Michael what he thought about metta practice and, um, the repetition of phrases and the cultivation of love. And he said, oh, it's crap. He wasn't big on it. And, but then he said to me, but I could do with a little love right now. So I said, okay. And we began to, work with a simple form of metta practice, repeating phrases, choosing someone or something that we wanted to focus our loving awareness on, we wanted to express our love for. And I asked him, who's the easiest person in your life to love? And he said, well, it's not a person. It's my dog, Jonesy. And I said, your dog? And he said, yeah. I said, okay, well, we'll start with your dog because that's what you often do with metta practice. You start with the person that's easiest for you to express your love for. And gradually, he would repeat, Jonesy, may you be happy. Jonesy, may you be safe. Jonesy, may you be filled with love. Jonesy, may you live with ease and free of all struggle. And we did this regularly. And you could see Michael's way change, and he softened. And I give all the credit to the metta practice and to his closer proximity with death. He had a challenging relationship with his wife. There was a great deal of love between them, but they had a high degree of independence, and they lived somewhat separately from each other. And they had two separate rooms, for example. But when Michael was dying, um, his wife was lying next to him in the bed, holding him. I think they made their own form of reconciliation. They were rediscovering love, a love that had always been there, but was hidden, I would say, under habit. Anyway, you all know about the power of metta, and you know that it's one of the four Brahma Viharas, the sublime states, the divine abodes. I think of them as four flavors of love. There's metta, loving kindness, and there's um, karuna, compassion. The deep wish to relieve suffering. There's appreciative joy, sympathetic joy, it's sometimes called. And there's equanimity. When they each have particular qualities that are important to cultivate in our lives. Here's the thing that I want to say just briefly, and that is that if love is so bountiful and endless, why do we get so caught up in scarcity? Why are we so busy holding our beloveds so tightly? I think it's because we often confuse love and attachment. Attachment masquerades as love. It imitates love. It says, I'll love you if you give me what I need. Love is focused on generosity. Attachment's obsessed with getting our needs met. Love's an expression of our most essential nature. Attachment is, well, we could say an expression of our personality. Love engenders faithfulness and aligns us with our deepest values and purpose in life. Attachment clings to fear and very tightly to what we want to be the end result. Love's selfless and encourages freedom, and Attachment's self-centered and it engenders possessiveness. Attachment leaves scars. And love, oh, it inclines us to gratefulness. Healthy attachment's necessary in life, right? It's wholesome, it's useful. It's essential in human relationships, actually, and particularly between mother and child. I think love is possible, though, without forming unhealthy attachments in which we cling to the point of not recognizing or allowing the inevitable truth of impermanence. Some years ago, I suffered a heart attack. I was teaching a retreat for doctors and nurses on compassion. In the middle of it, I had a heart attack. I was in the middle of like a Zoom call with Ram Dass, actually. And I had big surgery, triple bypass surgery. They split your ribs open and literally lift your heart up out of your body. And it was humbling. And when I came home, it was difficult. It was painful and I was depressed and I had a lot of fear. I wondered if I had any value anymore. Would I be able to return to what I did? My mind was distracted like a junkyard dog, I say, you know. And I couldn't do very much. I couldn't get to the toilet by myself. I couldn't take a shower. And I felt weak and helpless and inadequate. And it scared me when I looked at my scars. Unfortunately, I had people around me who loved me. My name was placed on altars, including the altar there at Upaya, and people prayed and practiced for my benefit. And I'm confident that I'm here because of those prayers. I hadn't known I was so loved. But really what happened was that love of others, it opened me to self-love. So profound, you know, that opened me even deeper to a boundless love, to a deep contentment that I felt nourished by and cared for, that I became intimate with. And for months I just cried, you know, and I would recognize again and again what a blessing of such love was in a lifetime. And I say to my friends, you know, the doctors told me I couldn't get my incisions wet, but I've been bathing in love every day. And that love, it opened me to a kind of deep trust. Not so much a trust in others or in past experiences, but to a kind of intelligence in each of us that's wise and functions as a guide for us. And this natural buoyancy began to fill me. And it wasn't about a belief. It was non-conceptual, actually. It was just this implicit trust that I could lean back into. Something I saw regularly when people were dying. And when I did, when I felt this trust, I could lean back into a kind of rest, actually, a profound rest, you know, body at rest, heart at rest, mind at rest, consciousness at rest. And it freed me from my obsession to make things better, to get over anything. And I remember thinking to myself one night, rest in love, Mike. Rest in love, rest in love. So here's the thing that I've learned from all these years of being with dying people. When people are sick or they're wounded or they're scared. Just love them. Just love them. Love them until they can love themselves again. That's what's worked for me. Sometimes it makes me wonder, maybe love is the best medicine. Love is the human quality that allows us to welcome everything, not just what we prefer, everything. So what enables us to move toward fear, not in order to conquer it, but to include it, to learn from it. In love, there's no separation. Caring for all things, all beings is a natural action of love. So when people are sick or wounded, just love them. Love them until they can love themselves again. I think when we live from that vantage point, we begin to see all kinds of points of connection between us. And I would say that love just breeds more love. Love just breeds more love. Thank you all so much for your willingness to listen and try your best to include love in your life. Thank you very much. Thank you, Roshi, for this kind invitation. Thank you, Noah, for once again loving and being kind to me and caring for me. And to all my dear friends at Upaya, I just want to remind you to trust your wise hearts. I really trust your wise hearts. And for all those who are listening, to tell you that your being, the awareness of your being, the loving awareness of your being will never abandon you. It will never, never abandon you. You can have confidence in it.